We're talking about a corporate giant that has major business dealings in, illegally occupied parts of Palestine. It is a big player in fossil fuel extraction. It's ruining the planet. And this same company goes on to buy this kind of wild subcultural festivals.
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. In each edition, we dive into a recent investigation exposing Europe's power brokers, from deceiving companies and influential lobbyists to corrupt politicians and financial fraudsters. I'm your host, Emma de Chatinier, recording here from Brussels. And as always, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter and my co-host, Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Emma.
Today, we're talking about one of the world's largest investment firms with a taste for techno, Colbert Kravis Roberts, or better known as KKR. Over the past years, it has quietly bought up some of Europe's biggest festivals, and not everyone is happy about it. Alex, what was the first festival that you've ever been to?
That brings us back 20 years. The Frequency Festival in Austria, in Salzburg, it was still taking place. It was raining cats and dogs for days. We were sitting in a tent drinking beer, listening to indie rock music. It was some of the best time I had in my life. I have such nostalgia for these days, but I'm not sure festivals are still like this today.
To dive into the story, we're joined by two of Follow the Money's in-house specialists on tax avoidance, fraud, and corruption. Henk Willem Smits leads our team that investigates big business. When investigating KKR, Henk Willem noticed that the firm has taken control of major European music festivals like Wacken Open Air and Sziget. And while tracing back KKR's investment trails, he uncovered that KKR has invested in some extremely controversial projects in Palestinian territories illegally occupied by Israel. Later, Salsabil Fayed will take us deeper into KKR's controversial investments. Welcome, Henk Willem Salsa. Hi.
Thank you.
So, Henk Willem, who is this financial giant quietly buying up Europe's festival scene, and what exactly did you uncover about them?
KKR is an American investment company. It has about $700 billion in assets, like other private equity companies. They buy up complete companies or shares in a company, and they try to make it more efficient or make it bigger. And then in 4 or 5 years, 6 years, they sell the company again, and they hope to make a profit. KKR, they bought last year a company called Superstruct, and this company had been quietly buying up festivals all over Europe.
And so this takeover of festivals started happening after the COVID crisis. But how did this story first come onto your radar? What made you realize that something unusual was happening here?
It was because of Boiler Room. In January this year, Superstruct bought Boiler Room. Boiler Room is a very pro-Palestinian platform. They organize parties and they film that. And they broadcast it on YouTube. It's relatively popular among people who like house and techno. And they posted on Instagram about their new owner, KKR, that they had big problems with that, but they couldn't help it. They couldn't help being sold to KKR. So they really took distance of KKR, and this is how also other DJs, mainly DJs in the UK, started protesting and canceling Boiler Room. And after that, more and more artists cancelled their shows because of KKR.
What makes KKR such a controversial company?
Most important reason is that KKR invests in defense companies, also defense companies who seem to have a link with Israel. And KKR invests in a website which rents out houses in occupied zones on the West Bank. The most controversial are the links to Israel, but there is more. There's also investments in coal and other CO2-rich projects. Gas pipeline in Western Canada, which is built on land of a so-called First Nation. Those are indigenous people of what is now Canada.
We're talking about a corporate giant that has major business dealings in, illegally occupied parts of Palestine. It also is a big player in fossil fuel extraction. it's ruining the planet. And then this same company goes on to buy this kind of wild subcultural festivals. Why does it touch such a nerve among people?
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I think people don't expect festivals to be a sort of asset or a commodity that is easily traded between these billionaire companies. So a lot of festivals are locally rooted, or they are subversive or underground. They see themselves as a heritage of the counterculture in which disco and house emerged. Feelings for a festival and what it should be. A company like KKR, it's just not a good fit for a festival or a book publisher, because it's about culture, it's about morals. That doesn't fit with an amoral investor who sees itself as apolitical and only looking to make more money.
And in your article, you explained that for a very long time, this takeover of festivals actually happened under the radar. And how is it possible that KKR and Superstruck managed to do this while going unnoticed for so long?
Well, this is something that private equity is quite good in. They didn't give interviews or something about this or send out press releases. There really was the idea to do it quietly. This may have to do with they don't want the audiences to know that these festivals are being financialized. But it's also to prevent that others copy the idea, which didn't work out, by the way, because others did copy the idea.
So it was very much a deliberate strategy to stay under the radar.
The founder, his name is James Barton. He gave a rare interview last year or 2 years ago, and he said himself it was really the idea to keep it as quiet as possible, that they were having a plan.
What you also explain is that these companies say that they're not just chasing profits. They claim that they're actually trying to sort of save the festival industry. Do you really believe that that's what they're after?
Well, it's not completely untrue, maybe, especially after Corona. There were some festivals that were struggling. It might be something that happens along the way, but the raison d'etre of these kind of organizations is to make $1, $2. And there isn't much, it's not charity here to save European culture.
Yet, festivals like Sónar in Spain and Zwarte Cross in the Netherlands have tried to reassure festival goers that their money will not end up in the hands of KKR. Sónar even wrote a statement on their website, which says, "At no time have we ever sent, nor will we ever send a single euro to KKR." Is that true? Does the festival goers' money actually not end up with KKR?
So this whole story may be true, that there's no money going to KKR, but it's also not that relevant. KKR doesn't invest for some dividends here and some dividends there. If Sónar keeps on being a popular festival, people come, it will keep its worth. And if they get bigger, or they do other editions in other towns, Sónar is in Barcelona, but also in Istanbul and Lisbon. So if they want to go to France or Italy too with a new edition, it will get bigger. It will be worth more in 5, 6, 7 years. And if it's worth more, then KKR will receive more money in the end, money of which you don't know how they will reinvest.
Since this story came out, you've also spoken to many of the organizers of those festivals, and you even joined a panel at the Dutch Zwarte Cross Festival. And after speaking to them, what's your sense of how festival organizers themselves are dealing with this takeover? How do they see that?
Well, at Zwarte Cross, which is a festival in the east of Netherlands, it's the biggest festival in the Netherlands. And it's really a sort of local thing. And they see it as a celebration of the local culture of this part of the Netherlands. And they find it horrible. They find it horrible that KKR bought the company. The owners never realized that this could happen. So they kind of, sort of suckered in. The organizers of Zwarte Cross befriended with the organizers of Wacken Open Air in Germany, which is a huge metal festival. Well, the organizers of Wacken, they got a bit old and they wanted to sell. So they sold it to the Superstruct and they said to Zwarte Cross, you should do it too. It will save you a lot of costs because everything is getting more expensive. They saw they could could save money and maybe even get bigger. They didn't really notice or didn't really research who the owner of Superstruct then was, that it was a private equity company with ending horizon. But when they were sold to KKR, they also didn't immediately notice that could be controversial. And at Zwarte Cross, they asked at Superstruct, what does this mean for us? And Superstruct told them nothing, and nothing will change. It's just another investor. And they believed that. And then when the controversy broke out in the Netherlands, also because of the follow the money story, they were extremely shocked and mad at Superstruct.
Are you essentially saying they had a choice and they made an uninformed decision, and now they no longer have a choice?
That's what they say. Yeah, they didn't pay attention to this ownership structure, and now it's too late.
Alex, as our correspondent of German-speaking areas, an interesting case in this whole story is actually Germany, because KKR has also taken over a lot of festivals in Germany, and they're also involved in one of the country's biggest media companies, Axel Springer. But unlike in Spain or the Netherlands, where there's been quite a lot of public outrage, that wasn't really the case in Germany. Why is that?
For historical reasons, Germany has a very different foreign policy approach to Israel. Sees Israel as the country of the survivors of the Holocaust. The Germans feel responsibility for the Holocaust, so they feel often very reluctant to criticize Israeli government actions. In the German media, there's a lot less discussion about, kind of these European economic and political links to Israel. German media is a lot more kind of careful when discussing operations like KKR and their business dealings in the Palestinian territories. So in some ways, it's not that surprising that we see a lot less discussion about this topic. But still, there have been, even in the German media, there have been a few reports that has created controversy in other places. In Germany itself, we have not seen the same level of acrimony and controversy about KKR.
So Salsabil, after this first story came out, you wanted to dig deeper into why exactly KKR is such a controversial player. How did you approach that research?
So actually, Henk Willem came to me and said, I worked on the festival story on KKR, and do you want to dig deep into the portfolio of KKR? There is a lot of boycott and controversy around KKR. So our idea was the pro-Palestinian activists, those who are boycotting these festivals, have a statement on KKR. We are here to see if it's accurate, what the claims are. So this was like how we went into it. We want to basically fact check and see if it is correct that KKR is profiting from the occupation or not. So I did what any journalist did, is put everything aside and focus solely on this story. So there are a lot of ways you can look into portfolios, investment portfolios of these companies. The good thing is that KKR itself publishes part of its investment portfolio. So on their website, they have either newsletters or they also have a list of all the investments they are currently doing. But not everything is on that because, as you know, private equity, its sole goal is also to stay, it's private. So in its essence, it's not public information. So it's really difficult to get all the information that you want on a deal, for example. So that's why we use several platforms, and there you have a lot more information on the deals or on mergers or acquisitions by KKRs. You always have to check what is published because it's not always accurate or up to date with the latest acquisitions, or they may sell a company, but it's not on the platform. It still says that KKR owns it. So you really have to look into each company first, make sure that KKR still owns it or has some sort of share, and then see what the company actually is. So it was fun work.
You really had to dig deep, and I think you went through an enormous amount of investments, right? How many cases did you investigate?
I would say 600.
So after spending all these hours behind your desk, doing all this investigative work, what are the main things that you ended up finding about KKR's investments?
So we found, for example, that they do invest in defense. So there is recently in July, they bought Spectris. So it's a British defense company, which is basically sort of a James Bond kind of company where they create they make high-tech tools. Spectris is also has also ties with Israel. We asked them if their tools or what they produce is also or could also be used by the Israeli army. But we didn't get any replies. So we cannot say these tools are used by the Israeli army. What we can say is for several companies that we found links with Israel through an agent, a salesperson in Israel, or an office in Israel.
There's not really another way also to check when a drone is shot down above Ukraine. The Ukrainians, they pull it apart and they say, well, look, these are the chips from NXP or another Western company. And here, of course, we don't have these resources to check exactly what is used. The strange thing, of course, here is that KKR doesn't speak on record about if this is true or not. The complete silence of KKR, which is, it's very strange for such a big investment company.
Strange, but probably on purpose.
They probably have a reason for it. They're super smart people who work at these investors. They're all econometrists from Harvard, and they're sort of rocket scientists. But you could also say that makes it even more strange that they are not capable of saying something about this.
Like what Henk Willem said, everything is so destroyed that the only way to prove it is to see a link. And the thing that we found is, for example, for the Spectris, is that they have a subsidiary in Israel. That subsidiary is testing F-35 planes, and they are working with Lockheed Martin. And we know that Lockheed Martin is profiting from the genocide. So it's not that we can say that KKR is profiting from the genocide. We know that KKR is profiting from stolen Palestinian land. This is a fact because they own a company, Guesty. Like Henk Willem said before, Guesty is like sort of a middleman between booking Airbnb and the person looking for apartments in the occupied Palestinian territories. So this part we know for sure. I talked with also private equity experts, and she also shows that and states that basically you know that if you're investing in Israel, defense in Israel is a huge part of the economy. So you cannot separate those two.
One of the companies that you also linked KKR to is Canvas, which is a digital learning platform used by many universities. And why did that particular company stand out to you?
So this one was a good find by our colleague, Nick de Jager. So he found that indeed, through looking at the portfolio, that KKR bought actually Instructure, which is a company behind Canvas. It's interesting to know because Canvas is in many, many universities, not only in the Netherlands, but also, for example, I know in Belgium, they are also in university and they are all over Europe. So what is interesting is that we had 2024 all these encampments by pro-Palestinian activists and students at the universities all over Europe, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, the UK, in the United States, of course. And what is interesting is that their claims was asking their universities to either share how much money goes to Israel or every link there was to Israel, and then to stop all investments. So when Nick talked to several students' organizations, they were really shocked about that information because, they said we've been protesting at our university for many months, and to know that basically that KKR owns Canvas, they were really not happy about that.
Yeah, because it's essentially, I think, similar to the tension that we've discussed in the case of festivals. Festivals, like universities, they're very strong on a certain identity, certain values. And then you have a company here that they certainly don't really seem to care, right?
Yeah, I think so too, because students have always been just like artists, always took moral stance in some cases. And this is also one of these cases they took a stand on.
And like the festivals, they're stuck in the greedy hands of a vulture capitalist without really wanting to be.
Yeah, without their knowledge. Yeah, I think it's more so without their knowledge. I think that's what shocked them the most.
But having all this pushback and having all this public discomfort, do you think this is also going to affect how profitable KKR is? And does this public outrage actually affect them in a negative way?
I do think this is bad. This could be bad because KKR is more, at least in Netherlands, in Spain and the UK, it's more top of mind. That is something these kind of investors don't like. They prefer to operate in the dark, count their money without people watching over their shoulder. And that is different now. You see in Spain, for example, cancelled permits for a couple of festivals of Superstruct. So that is real damage. This awareness, of course, can help or prevent other companies from getting in the hands of KKR.
I also think that KKR is so big and has a lot of expertise in doing risky investments. I would not think that KKR would not have factored the possible repercussion. When you do an investment, you always do a risk analysis and you do the best case scenario, you do the worst case scenario. Now the question is, did they expect this to go this far or not? And have they factored that in? That is a question that only they can answer. But yeah, I think they have made a risk analysis. The question is, how big of a risk analysis and cost to that risk analysis have they taken and factor into?
That they factor in followed money journalists going behind their whole business model. What we discussed is that it's not just festivals that are being bought up by private equity firms. KKR and other private equity firms are also putting their hands in many companies that you describe as they sell experiences rather than goods. And why is private equity doing that?
The trend in private equity is that they think that people spend more and more money on quality spending of free time. So they invest in casinos, in wellness center, in musicals, in Formula One and other sports events. And that is also where they see these festivals. So they don't see it really as culture, but more as entertainment, a place where they think more and more people will go. And so people don't go shopping for clothing or furniture, but they rather would spend their time at a festival is the thought. So they see a growth potential for this.
I think that we see a lot of examples of private equity taking over something that should be public. Take, for example, water infrastructure, healthcare, elderly care. So you see a lot of examples throughout Europe of private equity being involved there. And I think the question begs to, is that really a place where I would want to, for example, if I grow older, where I would want to be in my last years of my life, to be in an elderly care facility that is owned by private equity, knowing how they work, how they operate, and what their core strategy is. So I think people, but also myself, need to ask more these kind of questions. Do we want a society where private equity, which main goal is to make as much profit as possible when they sell an entity, a company? Do we want them to also be involved in sectors and infrastructure that should be publicly owned, like healthcare, like many, many examples? I think that's a question that we should ask ourselves.
That's where we'll leave it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Henk Willem and Salsabil. You can find the story in the show notes and on our website, ftm.eu. And Alexander and I will be back soon for another episode.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.